Welcome to the podcast. I'm Angela Bobier, and this is Life in the Talbot Settlement, brought to you by Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. In this series, we will do our best to give you a full appreciation of the history of Western Elgin County in southwestern Ontario, from First Nations to the early settlers to the 1950s. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge funding from Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. Welcome to episode 47 in our podcast, Life in the Talbot Settlement. Today we dive into the memories of local residents Edwin and Anne Gammon and their families. Listen along as we read about the trials, tribulations, and fond memories of homestead living in Western Elgin County. Before we begin, I want to thank Joyce McFadden for providing the museum with this file of her family history. The family history we received starts out with the marriage, and it says this is to certify that Mr. George Gammon and Anne Millen were solemnly united by me in holy matrimony at Hamilton on the first day of December in the year of our Lord 1860, conformably to the ordinance of God and the laws of the land, in the presence of, and it's signed by John Millen, Louisa Brown as the witnesses, and then W. Ormiston, D.D., who's the minister. Now, the great thing about the family history that we've received is that Edwin Gammon, a son, wrote down all of his memories. His memories written down are so good that I'm just going to read straight from what he left for us. Memories of Edwin Gammon. This is the history of father and mother written by Edwin Gammon, as near as I can recall some of the events as they happened. Father and mother were married at Hamilton the first day of December in 1860. They moved to Gosfield Township, Essex County, settled on a 50-acre lot on the north corner of the 9th Concession and east side of the Bell River Road, and built a log house. Uncle Tom Millen and Aunt Mary bought 50 acres across the 9th and lived for a time with father and mother until they built a log house. They both later built red brick houses, which are still in use. Ada and Adelia were born in the log house. Uncle Tom and Aunt Mary had one boy named Willie. Ada married Arthur Bruner, and they moved to Lawrence, Michigan. Harry and Ruby were born in Canada. Later, they moved to Chicago, where Arthur was employed by the McCormick Machine Company. Jesse and Arthur Bruner were born at Lawrence, Michigan. Arthur was salesman for the McCormick Company. While living there, the children became sick with typhoid fever, and Ada, nursing them, was taken ill with the fever and died, and was taken back to West Lorne and buried in the Gillies Cemetery near the old homestead in Elgin County. Alice went to live with Ada at Lawrence, Michigan, and met and married William Butcher. They stayed at Lawrence for a short time, then moved to West Lorne, where Anna was born on Christmas Day, 1891 or 1892. They later moved back to Lawrence, then moved to Montana, near Chinook. They took up land there, but Will had a heart attack and died. Father had sold the farm before this. In 1882 or 1883, Uncle Steve Millen took the Michigan Central train going east to visit some friends who had moved from Essex County to Dunwich Township, Elgin County. William Church and family, and John Shearing and family. While on the train, he got into conversation with a man, Elder Pollard by name, who told him of a farm of 100 acres for sale near the town of Bismarck, now called West Lorne. He stopped off at Bismarck and went to see the farm owned by Duncan Gillies on the south side of the 11th Concession, Lot 17 of Aldborough Township, Elgin County. He bought the farm and moved the family there just before Christmas in 1883. The farm was badly run down, and they had a hard time for a few years, but as the farm was improved and the family grew up, things became easier. There was a good bush on the farm, composed of hard maple, beech, soft maple, elm, basswood, black ash, and white ash. When the timber was cut off and wood and logs taken out, the brush was burned, and rye was sown, and a spring-toothed harrow used to cover the seed. The next spring, clover and timothy were sown for hay or pasture. It was usually a good crop. The rye had to be cut with the cradle and bound by hand on account of the stumps. Hay was cut with the scythe. Father, Arthur, and I were cutting it one day, and Father was ahead. He went across the field a way ahead of us and waited at the corner, and when we got up to him, Arthur said, "Why did you go so fast? Were you racing?" He said, "Oh no, I was alone." He had done a lot of that kind of work. I heard him say that one day he had cradled 4 acres of wheat in one day. I remember the first self-binder that was in the neighborhood. Mr. Thompson across the road bought it. They had wheat in the front field, and Father and the boys went across to see it, and of course I tagged along. It was a wonderful thing after using the cradle and reaper and binding by hand. Then after a few years, an agent came and sold Father one. When we went to the house, the girls were angry about it. No one said anything but Hannah, and she spoke what was on her mind. She said that we girls and Ma have no washing machine and have to use the scrub board and tub 2 or 3 times a week, and you will just use a binder 2 or 3 days in a year. I guess maybe they had a kick coming all right. One day we took the idea of going to the lake after supper and got the chores done early. We had a Democrat, and Dad and Mother, Hannah, Lizzie, Arthur, Mary and I went. I don't know where Edith and Johnny were, but it was a nice night, and when the moon came up, nearly full, it was beautifully clear and no wind. On the way home, Hannah and Lizzie started to sing. Arthur had a mouth organ, and I was driving the team. When we got near Eagle, a small village on number 3 highway now, the people came out to listen. A hotel stood on the west corner and a store on the east. A group of men stood on the hotel porch and another on the store porch, and people were standing outside their houses. Lizzie was a good alto singer, and you all know how Hannah could sing. They were singing the piece, Whispering Hope. It really sounded great. The air was so clear. There was a great clapping of hands. I often think of the times we used to have standing around the organ and everyone singing. Dad was a good singer, but I never remember Mother singing. I don't know whether she could or not, or was just too busy and left it to the rest. I am sure we all remember the family Bible reading and prayers night and morning also. After Ada died, Ruby, Jessie, and Arthur stayed and lived with us until their father was married to Minnie Alvoyd. Harry went to live with Adelia and Wes Brooker at their home near Cottam. Hannah took Ruby, Jessie, and Harry back to Chicago to live with their father. Arthur stayed with us until he grew up and was married. In 1904, Mary and Leo Bell were married, and Ruby and Jessie came back for a visit and attended the wedding. Mother became sick and died on March 18, 1908. She was buried in Evergreen Cemetery at West Lorne. The house was divided after Johnny and Myrtle were married. Afterward, Father, Mother, and Lizzie moved to West Lorne, where Mother died. Father and Lizzie lived together until Lizzie and Will Meldrum married, and they moved to Clive, Alberta. He came back to West Lorne in 1919 and lived with Hannah and Arthur and us, but never seemed satisfied. So Johnny moved back from the west, and he lived with them until he died in 1924 and was buried beside Mother. He was about 90 years of age. Mother was 67 years. One year we had 300 cords of cordwood, that is 4-foot wood, piled from the bush up the lane as far as the barn. It was piled 6 feet high, all hard maple and beech. About the 1st of December, we had a heavy fall of snow. We got the sleighs in the shop that day and did some repair work to them. The next morning, Arth, Johnny, and I started to draw wood to West Lorne. Johnny, having a better pair of sleighs and a longer rack, drew 2.5 cords at a load, and I 2 cords. We took 3 loads each a day, making 6 trips a day. We had the 300 cords out before Christmas. That was about the only sleighing we had all winter. Arthur helped load and unload. Father did the most of the chores. We had men cutting more wood that winter, and John and I drew 50 cords of green wood to West Lorne and piled it in the New York City Railway Yard on wagons. On the 50 acres we bought, back of the 100 acres, was a large chestnut tree. Father and the other boys cut it down and used a 6-foot-long saw, but they had to chop notches on each side to make room to saw. When it was down, it measured over 7 feet across the stump. They cut it into 12-foot lengths. Father got a teamster from town to come out with his team and got a neighbor who had a good team to come and take it into the mill. The butt log was so big and top-heavy, it upset 2 or 3 times before they got it to the road. Then when it was in the mill yard, it was so big when they got it on the carriage, it wouldn't go in the mill door. The log rule measured over 1,400 feet, but wouldn't measure it. They sent out word to go in and split it. So Father, Arth, and John went, and the men stood around to watch, thinking that they were going to have a hard time. There was a seam running down one side, and when iron and wood wedges were driven in, each side was so heavy it seemed to fall apart, and as it fell open, one side quartered up. They drew the lumber home and built an implement building out of it. It was the largest log we ever heard of in this district. I afterwards saw a chestnut log with 1,000 feet in it. When we moved here, game was quite plentiful. A lot of fox and squirrel, and occasionally lynx and wildcat. One night in the early spring, Mother was out the back door and heard a noise like a small child crying. Thinking it was Mary, who was small at the time, she thought nothing about it. When Mary came in not crying. But next morning, the neighbors across the road told us that there had been a wild animal of some kind back of our barn, which stood to the northeast of our house at that time. It was howling for most of the night, and when we went out and looked, we found large tracks behind a shed at the east end of the barn. It had thawed that night or day before, and the tracks were quite plain in the mud, 3 or 4 inches across. It must have been fairly large. A cow stabled in the shed must have had a good night's rest. The wind that night blew from the southeast and carried the sound across to the neighbors. One day that summer, John, Lizzie, Edith, and I, of course, all being young, started to go in the bush for some reason, to gather flowers, perhaps. We just got in the edge of the bush, and the wind was blowing quite hard that day. We heard a weird noise of some kind, and of course, hearing stories of lynx and such, we all turned and started to run. I fell down, and Johnny and Lizzie grabbed me, and we started for the house. We found out afterward it was 2 trees with limbs crossed and rubbing together that made the noise. There were several big cherry trees in the backyard and down the lane, which have all died long ago. A white oak tree in front of the house in the corner of the yard was said to have been started from an ox gad. There had been a logging bee that day, which were common at the time. The men went into supper, and one man stuck the gad in the ground and didn't take it with him when he left, and it took root and grew. I don't know if that is correct or not, but there was a nice white oak tree there until a few years ago when the lightning struck and killed it. Cliff Wilson cut it down and got some good oak lumber sawed. The stump is still there. The same locust trees are standing, and several more young ones around the yard. We used to call the farm Locust Shade. Arthur built a house and barn on the back 50 acres and lived there a few years, then sold it, and bought another 50 on the corner of Graham Road and Middle Street, then sold that and moved to West Lorne. He died from an operation in 1953. Johnny, being sick for 3 or 4 years and in the hospital for 8 months, died the 26th of February, 1958. Well, this is getting to be a long story and going to be hard to get it all printed, so I had better stop now. I hope there are not too many mistakes, and if there are some, please overlook them, as it has been a big job to get it all as it should be. I have tried to get everyone in their right place, and thank you all for the help you have given me. Sincerely, Edwin Gammon, West Lorne, 1958. Now, along with these stories, there's entire family history here of George Gammon and Ann Millen and all of their descendants. So I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode, and we hope you gained some insight into rural life in the late 19th and early 20th century. Are you interested in sharing your ancestors' written memories? Just send us an email or give us a call at the museum, 519-762-3072. Thank you for listening. Please share the podcast with your friends and follow us on all social media platforms at Backus-Page House. The Backus-Page House Museum and Tyrconnell Heritage Society acknowledges the land we are on today as the traditional territory of First Nations people. As settlers at a settler-focused museum, we value both the significant historical and contemporary contributions of all original peoples and ask how we can be supportive in Indigenous cultural renewal. Life in the Talbot Settlement is a production of Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. Your host has been Angela Bobier. Music provided by Jack Witmer. And thanks to our producer, Katlyn Reintsma. To make a charitable donation, become a Tyrconnell Heritage Society member, and to contact the Backus-Page House Museum, please visit our website, www.backuspagehouse.ca. Thank you again for listening.